Good afternoon. I'm Dr. James Anderson. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Marine Corps University. In January this past year, the People's Republic of China put out a policy statement on China's Arab policy. This is the first time that they have done that. And it's an interesting document. It's quite lengthy. It includes a fair amount of boilerplate about friendship and cooperation. It talks about energy. It also talks about peace and security. It's interesting on its own terms, and it's also interesting for its very existence. Why now they felt the need to announce to the world their Arab policy? They have been involved in the Middle East before, for decades at various levels. Does this signify something new? And if so, what? And what does that mean for the rest of us, for the other international powers, to include the United States? Does China's role, as it foresees it for the Middle East, envision a lessening, perhaps a further lessening, of our own role? Or perhaps there might be opportunities for China to play a constructive role, perhaps even in some areas a collaborative role with other great powers. This document, as well as Chinese behavior, raise a whole host of questions, big strategic questions about China's role in the world, but for today, specifically in the Middle East. Is it simply related to energy, China's energy needs, the strategic necessity referenced in the title? Or perhaps we may be seeing the start of something new, a larger Great Game competition. To help us sort through these and related questions, we are privileged to have Dr. Chris Young, who is our McCuff Chair in the Donald Bren Chair of Non-Western Thought. And he came here about a year ago and has been very active in the schoolhouses and giving lectures and testifying on Capitol Hill, and is superbly positioned to share his thoughts today. By way of background, he served a number of years at the Center for Naval Analysis, and then more recently at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, INSS, at National Defense University, providing advice and suggestions to the Joint Staff, to OSD, to the intel community, and to combatant commanders. So we look forward to your remarks. I should add, by way of closing, that this lecture here is part of a larger series that the Middle East Studies, which is headed by Dr. Amin Tarzai and also assisted by Adam Seitz, have created a lecture series with the theme of great power competition in the Middle East. So today we're going to focus on China. But coming up in a couple weeks' time, on 7 November, in this very room at this same time, we're going to have another Bren Chair, Dr. Brandon Dalrino, who's our Chair of Foreign Politics, and he's going to be talking about Russia's role in the Middle East, specifically with respect to Syria, some of the same questions that Dr. Young will be addressing today with respect to China. Dr. Young will give a presentation that will last about 45 minutes or so, and then he will be delighted to address your questions. So with that, a warm MC welcome for Dr. Young.
Thank you, James, for that fine introduction. And also the fact is you've just teed up the presentation. I think the entire first slide I've got is sort of posing the question, but James, you've essentially done that for me. The other thing I want to comment is this turnout is much bigger than I thought. I feel like I'm lecturing in front of a command staff college, entire college. So this is great too. You guys really must be interested in the subject because it's such a nice day out. So I'm looking forward to this. This is a great opportunity to share ideas on the subject, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have on this. Only thing I would add to James's question is what are the other China analysts who look at the Middle East saying about this? The question of why now and the timing is in part related to the fact that the recent agreement with Iran, with the Perm 5, may be the timing. That is, China has an opportunity to now develop a partnership with a major player in the region, Iran, who is less stigmatized and now is free to now engage more freely with some of the other great powers, China being one of them. And so that's the question. The question is, since the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in July 2015, some of the shackles and some of the limitations on Iran's interactions with some of the great powers is there. And China, who had always naturally been inclined to interact with Iran, may be seeing this as an opportunity. And so that's the question. Given the fact that this agreement has just been signed, does China now look at this as an opportunity, either A, to be more competitive in the region and perhaps to engage in another great game, to use the term, or does China's concerns in the region limit its ability to develop that deeper strategic competition? That's really that's the debate amongst the China watchers now. When you listen to people who study China and who think about the few of them who are out there who think about China and the Middle East seem to be engaged in this debate right now. So here's one perspective. I'm going to keep this up there for you to read it because this is one view. Jeffrey Payne from the NISA Center, Near East South Asia Center. He's their China expert. His view is this is an opportunity for China to deepen its strategic relationship with Iran. And given some of the actions that you're seeing China taking in foreign policy, especially under Xi Jinping, this is something we need to watch out for. And so Jeff's view is very, very distinct. It looks like we may be entering into a great game situation. You can tell I have a National Defense University background because it's exciting end to you guys. But another friend of mine, Joel Lucknow, who is at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs, disagrees. His view is there are a number of constraints on China's freedom of action in the Middle East. Too many balancing acts that they need to maintain. And so his view is, in contrast to his colleague at the NISA Center, is no, China will pursue certain types of deepening relationships with Iran, but they're going to be limited by certain factors. And so my task today is to sort of arbitrate between these two views, because I respect both these analysts. They're great analysts. They both read Chinese. They both spent a lot of time in China. They both know the country. They just happen to have a different opinion on the direction China will take in the Middle East. And so what's my view on this? Now, I'm not normally a China and the Middle East guy, but I am a China foreign policy, China defense policy guy. And so what I do is I take my understanding of China and then apply it to a question. The question is, what are China's likely actions in the Middle East, given what I know about China and the way I've analyzed China in the past? So today's roadmap, I'm going to give you sort of a framework to examine Chinese foreign policy. If you look at Chinese foreign policy, at least since the opening to the world in the late 1970s, early 80s, are there patterns of behavior that the Chinese have displayed that you can identify and say, yeah, that pretty much represents how the Chinese think about foreign policy? Secondly, I then apply that to the Middle East. Given that framework that I just described to you, can you then apply that to the way the Chinese behave in the Middle East? And then what does that suggest about the future actions the Chinese will take in the Middle East? And then finally, what are the policy implications? Based on your conclusions about what China is likely to do in the Middle East, what then can we conclude about U.S. policy towards China in the Middle East? For those of you who like visuals to understand the concept, this is sort of the process. What's the framework? What kind of pattern do we see of behavior of Chinese actions in the Middle East? What does that then do in terms of predictive speculation about Chinese future actions, and then what are the policy implications? All right, so if you look at Chinese foreign policy since Deng Xiaoping opened up China, roughly in 1978, 79 to the present, I think there are about 5 different filters you need to look at when you examine Chinese foreign policy. One of those filters is Chinese foreign policy principles. I'll, of course, go into all of these in detail, but they're principles the Chinese say that this represents Chinese foreign policy. We follow certain principles, we don't veer from them. While that's debatable, we have seen an evolution of Chinese application of their principles, but by and large, I think it's true that the Chinese say, here's what our principles are, and they have by and large since the 1980s stuck to these principles. And we'll talk about rates of change and whether or not they're altering their principles, and by and large, it's the first thing you need to think about. Second thing, China's place in the world. Where does China fit in the international system? And more importantly, what's China's relationship with the United States? So when you look at Middle East policy, you can't look at it in a vacuum. You have to look at it in terms of when China does something in the Middle East or any region of the world, they are always thinking, well, how does the United States fit into this? How do we react to the United States? Because they're Chinese, one of the oldest civilizations in the world. They think very carefully about political relations. If we do the following, what is the likely reaction from the biggest hegemonic power on the planet that we need to contend with over the next few decades? So you cannot escape from the fact that China, when it formulates its Middle East policy, will be thinking about what's the effect on the United States, what's our effect in terms of our relationship in the international system. Third, how does China conceptualize the world? When it looks at certain regions of the world, how does it prioritize its actions in the world? Does it view its actions in Asia different, East Asia different than it does in South Asia? Does it view its actions in the Middle East different than it does at home? How does China use force abroad? Sort of an interesting question. When China interacts with its military, are there certain patterns of behavior that we are noticing? So when the Chinese do things in the Middle East or in the Indian Ocean, are there patterns of behavior that we are noticing, how they utilize the People's Liberation Army? And then finally, an obvious one, because most of you have heard this, the Chinese are all about economics. They are all about the development of their economy. Therefore, how does that play in their calculus as they think about their relationship in the Middle East and their foreign policy? So those are the 5 filters, the 5 characteristics I would lay out that when you look at China's actions anywhere in the world, their foreign policy, you need to look at it through those 5 characteristics. So, Chinese foreign policy principles. So the Chinese will say our foreign policy principles go all the way back to 1955, the Bandung Peace Conference. We all got together and we formulated with a non-aligned movement this whole discussion about how we shouldn't be interfering in other people's business, etc. Okay, so that's 1955, a completely different Chinese foreign policy, different Chinese political leadership. Mao Zedong was in charge, Zhou Enlai was the foreign minister at the time. China has drastically changed its view of its role in the world and the kinds of things it says are acceptable behavior in the world. Nonetheless, there are definitely elements of that conference and of that agreement which you find in Chinese foreign policy pronouncements. And a couple of those I've listed here. So, China won't intervene or interfere in the internal affairs of another country. They are explicit when they say, we don't interfere in other countries. The United States is free to tell other countries what government they should have, whether it should be a democracy. The United States has no problem through the IMF telling other countries that they should refine and revise their economic systems. We're not all about that. We think that sovereignty is king. If a country wants to, now, crudely put it, if a country wants to abuse its citizenry, that's their business, it's none of our business. So there's a real transactional aspect of Chinese foreign policy, which makes China an appealing partner to many third world developing dictators, right? So China, we can have an entire discussion about the appeal of a Chinese approach to foreign policy when you don't care what the standards are of the government you're dealing with. The United States obviously has a very different view of that. So China automatically becomes an alternate model of interaction with a lot of these countries. But China's view is it's not our business to tell another country, another regime, how it should be interacting, how it should be treating its citizens. And we stick very strongly to that. Now that has implications. When should UN peacekeepers be used? If a country is going through genocide, China is very, very slow to say the UN is responsible for engaging, right? So principle 1, we should not be interfering in the internal affairs of another country. Use of force. China has said, we will not invade another country. We will not use force to illegally act to intervene. Now, obviously, in the 1950s, 1960s, you can come up with tons of examples where China uses force. Vietnam in 1979, they certainly used force there. 1950, they certainly used force. So if the cutoff is 1979, yeah, there has not been an example of overt invasion of another country or lethality being utilized in another country. You can debate whether or not their actions in the South China Sea violate that idea, but that's a debatable point. But the Chinese will say, our principle is we don't invade other countries. We leave that to imperialist hegemonic powers like the United States. China's use of force outside anywhere of China proper in the Asia Pacific has to be authorized either by the United Nations or there has to be an invitation from the host nation involved. So the counter-piracy operation in 2009 and extending all the way to the present, that involved the UN authorization. It also involved a government invitation for China to participate and be involved in counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. So the Chinese will say, we're not going to do anything outside of China unless, one, the UN authorizes it, or two, or both, we're invited by another country. They also make the argument that international relations should be based on mutual respect. That is, there's a democracy in international affairs. You shouldn't, so a thing like an organization like the Permanent Five, you should probably water down their authority, and the General Assembly should probably be given more power. So there's this very nice platitude they put forward saying, no, international relations really should be more democratic than it is. I don't know if I necessarily buy the Chinese argument that that's the case, because they certainly have acted otherwise. And finally, I mentioned before, because of China's strict non-interference policy, they will be very slow to intervene in internal crises of other countries. So the principle of responsibility to protect that's pushed forward by the United States and many of the countries' permanent Security Council members, which gives us authorization to intervene in things like genocide and other problems. The Chinese were very slow to sort of accept that principle, but are gradually coming around and saying, okay, we can see where it may be necessary to do that. So these are the principles that the Chinese have laid out as defining their foreign policy. Now, when we get to the end of this discussion, we can talk about areas where these principles are starting to evolve and change, because I think it's accurate to say that as China's interests grow and develop, that they're going to be thinking about ways to creatively support these principles, but yet satisfy their interests. So that's going to be the key question. What's the rate of change over time? Is China going to likely suddenly change these principles, or are they going to try and find creative ways to apply? That's the debatable question. Okay. To me, a more important question is China's relationship with the United States and its position in the world. And so this is, to me, an essential way of looking at China's view of its foreign policy and its interactions in different regions. So China right now recognizes that it has benefited from globalization, and it has benefited from the international system that the United States has created. There's no question that they have said this in strategic dialogues with us, that there's no question that the United States, as the primary guarantor of security and who has created an architecture which allows for free trade, has benefited China. And they also recognize that China, in growing, developing, building, will increase its interests, and suspicion of China will grow, but China has no desire to necessarily overturn that order. Now, there are different interpretations of the challenge China could pose to the United States. One interpretation is China wants to keep the system exactly as it is. They just want to push us off the top. So argument one is, does China want to completely disrupt, destroy, and completely eradicate the international order? I think logically you would say probably not, because they benefited. They see that their continued economic development will depend on the international order. Second argument, China may want to push the United States off the top of the hill and simply inherit the international order that is in play right now. The argument against that is, why would China want to accept the systemic cost of doing that? Would China want to then respond to every hotspot in the world? Again, all debatable points. Smart analysts argue over these points and disagree. I tend to believe that that's not the case, that the Chinese don't want to to inherit the system as it is because they don't want to assume all those costs. They don't want to spend blood and treasure, especially since the United States seems to be willing to do it. Right? They're looking at us and saying, free ride, free ride. Why should we have to do that? Now, at the same time, China also recognized its power is growing exponentially. They are the second largest economy in the world. Their military is consistently growing. They've been growing at 10%. Their defense budget has been growing at 10% for over a decade. So the Chinese correctly recognize that as they grow militarily, economically, and politically, they're saying to themselves, the United States has got to be looking over its shoulder as we're coming up upon them. They have a term for it, it's called the Thucydides trap. That is, and that's the whole argument that Athens and Sparta, same dynamic. One rising, the other one sort of looking over its shoulder, eventually leading to conflict. The Chinese are very worried about this. They're worried that as they grow, that we then, the United States, then becomes extremely suspicious of China's rise, and we end up in a security dilemma. To some degree, you're seeing that dynamic playing out right now in the South China Sea. The Chinese say this is for our defensive purposes. We say, no, you're violating international order. The Chinese then say, okay, we're going to put surface-air missiles to make sure to send you guys a signal. We then send a destroyer through to show resolve. So right now, we're in the middle of what you might call a security dilemma that's sort of playing into the Thucydides trap. So the Chinese are very concerned about this. They have put a lot of intellectual capital into thinking about, all right, how do two major powers, one rising, the other in an established order, manage that relationship? They call it a new type of major power relationship, where they interact with us and they say, here's what that kind of interaction should look like. So it's clear that the Chinese are worried about this. It's clear that we think about these issues too. So at the highest levels of government, we interact and talk about these things. But it's clear that this is shaping the way the Chinese think about their role in the world, their relationship with the United States, and ultimately, I would argue, how they would behave in areas like the Middle East. So, if by extension, you would argue that the Chinese are going to be particularly sensitive to acting out in areas of the world that's of vital interest to the United States, such as the Middle East. So it suggests to me right off the bat that the Chinese are going to be sensitive to that. Maybe they're willing to push us and press the envelope, but they're certainly going to be sensitive to the fact that the United States has vital interest in the Middle East and sees that as an extremely important part of the globe. Additionally, the United States has said we are the guarantors of security, and at least for the Gulf countries and the Persian Gulf. We haven't backed off of that policy stance. The Chinese recognize that. And I mentioned before about China willing to take on the role of systemic manager. The Chinese have another word, which is, when we interacted with the Chinese, we said, so how does China look at security, the international environment going out the next 20 years? And they came back and they said, we have still concluded that we are in a period of strategic opportunity. What they mean by that is, this is an opportunity for China to grow, to modernize, and to get to a certain level of prosperity, whereas we can then are more in control over our own destiny. What that also means is, we're happy to free ride off of you guys as long as you're willing to let us do it. That to me is what a period of strategic opportunity is. So this largely lays out the structure of China and its relationship to us, and China and its interactions in the world. And you have to keep that in mind as you think about their interactions in the Middle East, Indian Ocean, other areas of the world. Now, it's not all rosy, however. China, at the same time, believes that the balance of power is shifting, that certain countries, the BRIC countries in particular, especially Russia, Brazil, and India and themselves, are growing economically, and therefore they need to have, and particularly China needs to have a greater voice in international affairs. So the Chinese will argue that, yes, we recognize that our relationship with the United States needs to be carefully managed, but the United States needs to give in too. The United States needs to negotiate with China and discuss with China its views on system management. Therefore, the United States needs to seriously consider voting rights, giving additional voting rights to China in the IMF. The United States needs to think about allowing certain institutions that China puts forward to be a good stakeholder in the globe, like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which the United States initially opposed, but then backed down because other countries essentially sided with that concept. And so the Chinese have said the United States has to be willing to allow for reform to take place in the international system. Additionally, and here's an interesting twist on all this, it is clear that our budgetary problems, our dysfunctional political system, some of the difficulties we're having in terms of our security management across the globe is stretching the United States thin. So whereas until 2008, before the financial crisis, the Chinese looked at the United States as the grown-ups in the room. Once the financial crisis happened, the rose-colored glasses came off. Because one thing the Chinese saw from that was, one, maybe these Americans don't have their act fully together. That is, the fact that financial crisis actually took us by surprise, and that it was clear that our administration was having difficulties managing it, and that we didn't have all the answers. That sort of led to a thesis in China that is, hey, you know, we may need to be thinking about the day when the United States can't manage the international system. So yes, the Chinese looked at the international order managed by the United States, and they're going to adjust their foreign policy accordingly, but they also have to take into account the possibility that the U.S. lacks the budgetary power, the military power, and the willpower to stay present in, globally. And so they have to think about the day when maybe they need to fill a vacuum that the United States withdraws from. Now, from where we're sitting, most American strategists and policymakers say, yes, we have difficulties, we're trying to manage this thing, but we're not contemplating the day of the U.S. demise internationally. The Chinese, however, are perfectly willing to be cold-blooded and calculated in thinking about the day when the U.S. can't do what the U.S. has stated it's going to do, which is to maintain international order. So they honestly have to think about, okay, well, what happens if the United States does have to withdraw from some of these regions? What happens if this revolution in energy in the United States means that they're going to cut and run in the Middle East? Do we need to think about what an increased presence in the Middle East for China needs to look like? And so yes, there are strategists and policymakers in China who have to think about that. Additionally, China, their vision of the world as it's evolving is that we're naturally moving away from a world where the United States dominates the entire globe to one where we have multipolar blocks. That is, U.S. dominates the Western Hemisphere and maybe parts of Europe, a European Union or Russia dominates Europe, and China feels that its rightful place is to dominate the Asia Pacific. Now, in another lecture, I'll talk about the dangers of that perspective, but by and large, the Chinese view the natural order of the international system going towards these multipolar blocks. Additionally, the proper management of international relations means that these countries, these blocks being dominated by these different major powers, the way you manage international relations is you defer to a major powers block. You'll say, okay, so the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere and parts of Europe. So therefore, the way we interact with the United States is we defer to what the U.S. says is these are our key national security interests. Now, quid pro quo. As a result, U.S., you should now respect our core interests. And so what you see a lot in the discourse between China and the United States is, hey, our core interests are South China Sea, maritime sovereignty issues, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, etc. Those are core interests to China. Why, United States, are you messing around with our core interests? We don't mess around with the Western Hemisphere or your core interests, you should do the same. So that's the Chinese mindset, which is you have core interests, we have core interests. Now, the dynamic I've just described has a geographic component. That leads me to my next slide, which talks about how China divides up the world and how it prioritizes the world. So clearly, by Chinese reasoning, core interests always reside in your national security sovereignty interests, right? So clearly, interests that directly impact China's national security, its maritime sovereignty, its territoriality are key. Therefore, China will say, we're willing to go to war over these issues. Taiwan, they consider a core interest. If the United States messes around with Taiwan, the Chinese have, now it may be deterrence by statements, deterrence by declaratory policy, but that's what the Chinese have said. As you radiate outwards, you get a peripheral area, which is important to China's interests, and then you have an outer area, which is of lesser importance, but nonetheless will have an impact on China's interests. So this peripheral area, to include the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, has an impact on China's core interests. And that impact would be if China needs certain raw materials and energy in order to continue China's economic development, then those peripheral areas are important for that reason. If these areas also involve foreign fighters and terrorists entering into China and causing instability in China, then those interests need to be addressed. And so I've put this out because this gives you a concept of China's view of the world, that its core interests are those interests that China is perfectly willing quickly to declare, declaratory policy will indicate we're willing to fight over these things, and then as you radiate outward, they're willing to negotiate and talk a deal with you. Now, to me, this really explains the difference in their behavior in a place like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and perhaps their actions in the Indian Ocean and outward because of this concept. All right, now China's use of its military out of area. One of the things we've definitely noticed is a distinct pattern of Chinese actions outside of China proper. So the Chinese have not placed bases anywhere. They've said we will not form military bases anywhere. Now we'll talk in a second about Djibouti and what that means and some of the ideas about installations and logistics facilities. But the Chinese have said no military bases as we traditionally know it. The Chinese domestic law calls for the use of force or the use of counterterrorism troops if authorized by the country invites China in, or the UN authorizes. So the Chinese have prepared the legal groundwork to say, okay, if country X, and that could be in the Middle East or elsewhere, says we need help in terms of a counterterrorism response, and we're inviting China in to do it, then China has said, well, okay, legally, from the Chinese point of view, we have authorization both from the country who's invited us in, and we, as a country, are authorizing our military to then respond. Additionally, the Chinese are very careful about the size of the footprint. They are very minimal when they do exercises. They pull into the port. They are minimal in terms of the number of sailors they bring ashore, etc. So they are very conscious of the size of the footprint that they put ashore. In fact, some of the earlier exercises they undertook for the Gulf of Aden counter-piracy, they would send in their replenishment ship, completely resupply and come out and do replenishment at sea out of concern for that light footprint. And so the Chinese are very conscious of the size and the impact it has on the locals. Additionally, there's another pattern we notice. China will cooperate and interact with other countries for exercises and operations, but they will never formally take part in a task force. For example, our formal task force to deal with counter-piracy has a formal organization structure. The Chinese will say, we're not playing that. We're not going to be part of a task force where we got to answer to you. So this is an image thing. It's a China's place in the world thing. They'll say, we'll coordinate with you. We'll send LNOs over and occasionally have a discussion with you and we'll deconflict, but we're not going to be formally part of your task force. So bottom line is, China's actions are specifically tailored to deal with a very narrow set of security interests abroad. And so if they have a non-combatant evacuation operation, they're going to design forces to specifically deal with that contingency. If they've got HADR, they're going to specifically deal with a humanitarian assistance disaster relief operation. If they've got UN operations, they're going to specifically design force packages to deal with that. They're not going to show up en masse to have an overwhelming military presence in the region because they're specifically tailoring their military operations abroad to specifically focus on these specific narrow threats to their own interests. And that does a couple of things. One, it's less threatening to the big hegemon on the block. It says, we have this interest, we're going to focus on dealing with that specific security interest. And so the Chinese are very careful about how they use their force and how those troops are sent abroad and sent into the international environment. And then finally, the most obvious factor is geoeconomics. Geoeconomics in command. So the Chinese Communist Party has stated, listen, our number one priority is continued economic development. We, by the mid part of the 21st century, need to have arrived at a certain degree of development. Now, they are the second largest economy in the world, but in terms of per capita GDP, they're a little better than many developing countries. You go out to the countryside and you might as well be in a third world country from the 1940s or 50s. And so the Chinese want to raise everyone's standard of living to the point that they are a medium-sized European country, Netherlands, Holland, whatever. Now, at the same time, that still means that their military is continuing to develop, but by and large, their focus is on their economics. And so this has a number of foreign policy implications. China needs energy, raw materials, rare earths, to come from different parts of the world and brought to China. Certainly has implications in terms of sea lines of communication, protection, and access. Secondly, another strategy is to send people out, companies out, state-owned enterprises out, and be enterprising, go into these different parts of the world and make money. So you're going to see 38,000 folks in Libya trying to, which is what was the case when the Libya Neo took place, trying to start up businesses. And so you see activities in Africa, Latin America, and different parts of the world. That's what that is also about. And then finally, the concern that in a conflict, China's adversaries cut off access to that energy. And the Chinese leadership has specifically cited the possibility that the United States cuts off access through the Malacca Strait and the use of the U.S. maritime dominance to prevent China from getting access to this energy. And so some of their strategy has involved, one, developing a military to maintain sea lanes of communication, but also there's an infrastructure development aspect of this. What are ways around the maritime domain in which we can assure access to energy? And so all this discussion of pipelines, infrastructure development, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is throwing trillions of dollars of investment in South Asia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, in order to develop the infrastructure to maintain that access, is part of this larger foreign economic strategy. And then finally, China will invest heavily in transportation infrastructure, ports, and so many of the investments you see, Wadar being one of them, some of the different investments in the Indian Ocean is part of this whole effort to maintain access and to continue China's economic development. So those are the five characteristics that I think we need to think about as we look at China in the Middle East. And so how does this affect China's behavior in the Middle East? What have we seen in terms of Chinese actions taking place in the Middle East as defined by these five characteristics that I've talked about? And so let's start off with China's view of core interests. So if China looks at China security and China economic development and the survival of the party as key, then they clearly look at the Middle East in two ways. One is the Middle East serves as a very rich pool of energy to maintain China's continued economic development. So concern over stability and concern over a diverse source of energy is China's main concern. So they're going to be primarily concerned about stability. Now that's an overlapping interest with the United States. We are concerned about stability in the Middle East. Well, the Chinese are also concerned because they're even more dependent on Middle East crude than the United States is. Additionally, as I mentioned before, since the energy is coming from the Middle East and has to travel long distances, the Chinese are clearly going to be thinking about protection of transit routes and protection of that energy and those raw materials coming to China. So those are going to be the two dominating features when it comes to continued access to energy from the Chinese perspective? Well, another concern is the fact that the Middle East serves as the ideological and theological point of origin for many foreign fighters or homegrown terrorists who go into the region and go back and can cause a lot of trouble to China. So China has its own terrorist threat, its own insurgency problems on its own. And so the Chinese have to manage that security threat as well. And the behavior and actions you see reflected in Chinese actions, the extradition treaties China signs with some of the countries in the region, intelligence exchange, law enforcement exchanges with the countries in the region. And then finally, the Chinese have a larger umbrella organization known as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which it interacts with countries abroad, right now primarily Central Asia and Russia, in order to deal with international counterterrorism issues. And so they will use the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a platform to conduct large-scale exercises, counterterrorism exercises, which they will have in China or they'll have in one of the Central Asian countries. Well, this could, and there are signs that this could expand to the Middle East. Iran is applying for membership, and China, we'll talk a little bit more about China's, some of the initiatives China's having with Iran. That's one of the things China's saying, we support Iran being part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So China's actions are clearly being defined by its core, the view of its core interests and its relationship with the Middle East in relation to its core interests. China's view of its relationship with the United States and its position in the world. Now, I think I've gone over some of this. One of the arguments is that China is going to be particularly sensitive about how the United States responds. They're going to be particularly aware that the United States insists that it's going to be the security guarantor of the region, and so China will act accordingly. It is not going to attempt to form closer relations with the countries in the region, particularly Iran, if that serves to disrupt the region, and especially if it gives the United States the impression that the Chinese are starting to generate direct political competition with the US. The main reason China probably will not want to do that is, let's just imagine that given the fact that the United States' reliance on Middle East oil is becoming less and less, we may essentially make a strategic decision 10, 20 years down the road. We've had enough. We don't need to deal with this. We're cutting back. The Chinese then would be in the position of having to essentially be the security guarantor of the Middle East. And I'm pretty sure the Chinese don't want that at this very moment. And probably do not want it over the next 2 decades or so. So I would argue that their position vis-a-vis the United States, their concern about their position in the world, as well as their desire not to actually be the security guarantor of the Middle East, probably suggests they're going to be very cautious about how they approach generating political competition in the Middle East. Now, again, this is the heart of the debate amongst China watchers. Will China develop closer relations with Iran to sort of serve as a balance of power against US relations with Saudi Arabia and other countries? My suggestion or my inclinations is that China will be very reluctant to do that. China will want to maintain good relations with both, and certainly don't want to be left in the position of having to suddenly be the guarantor of security in the region. A debatable point, though. I mean, stranger things have happened. But nonetheless, my inclination, based on my look using the framework of analysis, would suggest that China would be slow to do that. China's use of the military in the Middle East. China's interactions with the Middle East has been somewhat limited. So they've really only used their military for military diplomacy, building partner capacity, and then limited actions through UN authorization or by invitation from the host nation countries. So the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, UN peacekeeping operations, Lebanon, Western Sahara, South Sudan. Again, very limited use of the military, not a broad brush. Actually, I've had discussions with the Chinese military over this issue, and their view is, listen, America has the finest military in the world, but you guys are like a hammer looking for a nail. We tend to be very, very surgical about how we utilize our military. And I guess that, and I suppose that's true because they're very, very restricted in how they utilize their military for foreign policy means. Another data point, the Chinese used to sell arms to the countries in the region, particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia. They cut back on that when they realized that that was having disruptive effects in the relationship with the United States and in their image in the world. So they completely cut back on that. Now, will they continue or ramp that up? Given they can now do that with Iran. I'll give you my conclusion later on that. But my tendency is to say no. They're more concerned about the larger implications of suddenly selling large amounts of arms to Iran. And then I mentioned before that China passed a domestic law that authorizes the PLA and Chinese law enforcement to go into other countries to do counterterrorism if invited by the other country and if authorized by the United Nations. So it's conceivable that China could be invited by a Middle Eastern country to help them with counterterrorism if they're invited. Now there are a lot of boxes that need to be checked, but it's entirely feasible that you could see that in the future. The other thing I would add is the fact that the Chinese have also recently begun marrying their peacekeeping operations with their counter-piracy operations. So you have special forces on those counter-piracy ships. Those ships pulling in the ports in the Indian Ocean they went and they got authorization from the UN to marry those two forces if necessary. So there could be some sort of contingency happening in the Middle East, the Maghreb, or some other places in this area. And if the UN authorizes it, the Chinese could marry peacekeeping troops that they have in some sort of peacekeeping operation with the troops who are on board those counter-piracy ships. So that's in place to happen. What you simply need to happen is some sort of contingency which would prompt them to then put those two together. And for me, that's not far from, and I've made this argument and I've sort of gotten different responses, but in my opinion, I don't see it too far a day when China could have their own version of an ARGMU, the Amphibious Ready Group, Marine Expeditionary Unit, sailing around, doing good, and responding to crises like NEOs or counterterrorism. I think that entirely fits in the framework that I've talked about. It's very tailored use of force, responds to specific contingencies, and the fact that it's almost a model of how we do it. The U.S. would be I think would be, well, not perfectly comfortable, but we would understand what they're doing. So our ARGMU model is something, and the Chinese are also known for copying what we do. So when we had a very successful hospital ship and response to the tsunami in 2004, the Chinese immediately started copying us, building their own hospital ships, doing their own medical diplomacy. So it's not out of the question that the Chinese could copy the kinds of things we do, and one of those things could be ARGMU operations of their own. Geoeconomics in command. The bottom line from this slide would be the Chinese are going to be absolutely concerned about maintaining a diverse source of energy, and therefore they're not going to be playing favorites over one or the other. To argue that they're going to then side with Iran to the exclusion of Saudi Arabia, which currently is their largest provider of energy, to me strikes me as probably not going to be the case. That they want to maintain a diverse set of sources of energy, and it's not just those two. They've got sources in other countries as well, Oman, other places. So they're going to want to maintain good access to a lot of the countries in the region to maintain their access to crude. So that's one bottom line. Additionally, in general, the Chinese want stable relations, a stable environment in the Middle East. Their trade is growing. Their bilateral trade has grown enormously with all the countries in the region, and so they're going to want to maintain a pretty good, stable region as well. And so I would argue that any type of action they would take to disturb the economic relations of the region is probably not in China's interest, and they're not going to be pushing for that. Okay, so Chinese foreign policy principles. This has a play in the Middle East in the following ways. Because they are strictly neutral and non-interfering, this has largely meant that the Chinese have been unwilling to weigh in on some of the biggest political disputes in the Middle East. So you name it, Israel, Palestine. The Chinese will say, we have a policy paper which talks about how the two sides can get together. The two sides have gone to China and said, will you mediate? And they say, no. So they're not even willing to mediate, right? They're not willing to stick their necks out, right? But you name the political dispute in the Middle East and the Chinese will have nothing to do with it. How about Saudi Arabia versus Iran? Are you kidding? The Chinese want good relations with both. If they get pulled in, taking one side or the other, which mediation unfortunately does involve you essentially saying, hey, you, Iran, you're being a little unreasonable in this. Can't you give a little bit? The Chinese don't even want to do that. The rise of the Shia crescent, the Chinese, and Sunni responds to that. The Chinese don't want to have anything to do with it. So the biggest impact, I think, with regard to their foreign policy principles is the fact that this makes them a very weak intervener in international affairs in the Middle East because they're not willing to put any skin in the game, all right? Whereas the United States, seeing itself as a security guarantor in the region, is willing to put skin in the game and saying, we think it's important that we have peace in the Middle East and therefore we are willing to be a mediator. We're willing to put forces in this area. And to me, this is the strongest reason why I think the United States will continue to have a larger-than-life impact on that region, whereas China is not willing to do it. Their neutrality, their non-interference is going to prevent them from doing that because they're too cautious and their foreign policy principles will prevent them from doing that. Now, non-interference does give China some advantages in interacting in the Middle East. So, for example, they have no problems siding with Russia with regard to its Syria policy because they don't have any political objection to an Assad regime. So they're perfectly willing to say, Russia, we don't necessarily agree with Russia's tilt toward Syria, but we don't have a problem with the Assad regime. We don't walk in and insist that the Assad regime has to go as a precondition to whatever political solution. So to some degree, China has advantages, but nonetheless, that creates, as I mentioned before, it creates disadvantages when it comes time to actually resolve the issue. The one thing I would also add is China's non-interference neutral policy does separate China from Russia, in that the Russians have said, we're siding with the Assad regime, we're going to be placing military forces in Syria, and we're going to be using Iranian military bases. Well, the Chinese are studiously separating their actions from the Russian actions. That is, they'll say, we'll vote with the Russians in the UN, we'll essentially give you aid and comfort with regard to ideological support, but we're not going to be giving you much more than that. Now, the one exception to that is the Chinese provided a PLA Navy ship to help transport those chemical weapons coming from Syria. They were saying, we're neutral, we're willing to use one of our Navy ships to transport because that helps. But by and large, I would argue that the biggest restraint to China being a proactive actor in the Middle East is their reluctance to actually take sides and actually do something. And we all know that the Middle East is explosive with political differences and security issues. And the Chinese are desiring of maintaining good relations with everybody and diverse access to their energy has made them very cautious about just sort of jumping in, wading in, and serving as mediators or having a real impact on the region. All right, so I think you guys are starting to get a sense of which side I'm taking on how China, whether this is a great game or if it's a strategic necessity on China's part. So before I go into that, though, what's happened with China and Iran since the signing? And so a couple of initiatives. China and Iran, they promised to get to a goal of about $600 billion in trade by 2026. China's promised to increase aid through the AAIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, to Iran. So increased aid. You're seeing a number of different deals with regard to the construction of power plants and gas pipelines from Iran to Pakistan. And at the political level, you're seeing promises of enhanced political interaction. So a promise to have foreign ministers exchange every year. And then additionally, China has within Chinese foreign policy, there are categories of relations. And the highest category is comprehensive strategic partnership. And China has conferred that upon Iran. They've said Iran is enough of an important partner that we're conferring upon Iran the highest level. Now, it's short of an alliance, but it signifies that China highly values its political relationship with Iran. Now, all of the above, however, seems to fall within the framework that I've talked about, particularly the emphasis on geoeconomics, the economic emphasis. But given the fact that I think China's framework of foreign policy applies here, my conclusion would be that you're probably not going to see a lot of very deepening and widening of its strategic relationship with Iran. So I seriously doubt, and you guys can then come back 5 years from now when I'm wrong on this, but I doubt that China is going to throw all of its eggs in one basket by siding with Iran to Saudi Arabia's detriment. China is going to studiously balance the geopolitical relationship in the region because it wants to have continued access to all of the energy resources from all the different countries. So it's going to be very careful about that. And in particular, and remember Iran too. Iran associated with international terrorism and a foreign policy that's counter to the United States. China is not going to want to pitch its caboose to that train because it automatically puts China at odds with U.S. foreign policy in that region. And then that also puts China at odds with U.S. policy globally, because if China sides with a country that is known to have sponsored international terrorism and is counter to stability in the Middle East, what China is saying is we're also about countering U.S. stability and peace and stability globally. And so the Chinese are going to be very reluctant to openly and overtly say we're going to side with Iran in order to further Chinese interests at the expense of our relationship with the United States. Because the other aspect of this is China's relationship with the U.S. still dwarfs any benefits it's going to get from its relationship with Iran. Its trade with us still dwarfs its economic relationship with Iran, and maintaining good relations with the U.S. internationally, globally, still outweighs any benefits the Chinese would get from a good relationship with Iran. China's not likely to, based on their limited use of military in the region and internationally, they're not likely to form full-fledged military alliances in the region. They're also going to be very slow and reluctant to have a forced presence in the region. I mentioned some possibilities. They could respond with counterterrorism opportunities and operations in some of these countries, but not a large-scale military presence in the region. Additionally, China is unlikely, as I mentioned before, to form an anti-American policy line with Iran. That is, Iran's general line in the Middle East is an anti-American one. China is not going to want to do that for all the reasons I've listed above. And then finally, China may increase its arms sales to Iran, but they're going to be very careful about what they sell to the Iranians, because if there's any type of arms sale that is really disruptive and threatening to some of the other countries in the region, that's going to blow back on China. And China has already had blowback of these kinds with regard to arms sales in the past. So they're going to be very careful about the types of sales they're going to have with Iran, even though they're free to do so now, given the signing of the JCPOA. So this slide really says they're going to forge deeper economic and diplomatic relations with Iran. They're going to, based on increased security, political, and economic interests, as those interests increase. So let's just take the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is that investment initiative I talked about. That alone will increase China's security, political, and diplomatic interests in the region. And so China's interests in this regard are going to increase. So they're going to expand their military, their economic, their diplomatic initiatives and activities in support of those interests. But I would argue that as long as the United States remains dominant in the region and remains the guarantor of security, they're going to increase their activities within that structure. But they're not going to try and violate that structure because, one, they would rather have the United States maintaining security and maintaining the international order in the Middle East, and they're perfectly willing to free ride off of that. You know, to them, it's like having their cake and eating it too. I don't think there's a Chinese phrase that captures that, but that pretty much is what it is. We're going to leverage off the fact that the U.S. is present in the region and is going to provide security guarantees. We can continue to be neutral. We can continue to have access to energy in the area, and we can continue to increase our military operations to support our specific security interests without necessarily getting the U.S. upset and without necessarily overturning the order that has been imposed on the Middle East by the United States. China's policy of strict neutrality, I will argue, will limit China's, the countries in the region will seek China's role as an arbitrator, but China will be very reluctant to do that. That is, because China is so strictly neutral, its ability to do that is going to be very limited. In other words, you're not going to see China anytime soon playing a very significant role in Israel-Palestine conflict, or to serve as a mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, one thing I leave you with is also the fact that if the United States does start to withdraw or diminish its role in the Middle East, China has to start thinking about what that means. And so so if the United States, for strategic reasons, concludes, hey, the shale revolution and other technologies means that we can cut our presence in the Middle East and we can sever our security ties there at minimal cost to the U.S. So if we decide to pull back, the Chinese are then going to, I think, have to think about filling in that vacuum. Now that's a different conclusion than the Chinese are going to be pushing up against us to compete. So in other words, the Chinese are perfectly willing, perfectly is not the strong word, they're going to reluctantly be willing to play some sort of greater role if the United States pulls back and withdraws. Now, I have seen no plans or any indication that the U.S. has any desire to pull back, but I'm just thinking long-term strategic calculation, because if you see a lot of articles being written, it's what are the implications of a lot of these energy revolutions going on within the United States? Does that mean the United States must still be committed to the Middle East? Well, the Chinese read our stuff too, and so they see that we are looking at these questions, and from their point of view, they have to think about, well, what does that mean if the United States withdraws from the region? Does that mean that we have to step up? All right, so a cautionary note. My argument is based on the idea that a framework of analysis is going to guide China's view of its interactions in the Middle East. So a little bit of the counter-argument. There are analysts who say, all well and good, but we've also noticed that Chinese foreign policy principles change. Yeah, so what's this about no invasion, right? Well, what's this about China respects everyone is equal, yet their behavior in the South China Sea doesn't seem to reflect that. So the counter-argument is China's foreign policy principles are changing, because as China's interests become global, so do their principles. In other words, the Chinese 10 years ago, 8 years ago would have said, no way do we support responsibility to protect. We absolutely say that, if a country's committing genocide, then tough, we can't do anything about that. Well, they've evolved their thinking. Under what circumstances do we need to think about when UN peacekeeping operations take part? The Chinese have said no military bases, yet you have a facility in Djibouti being constructed where Chinese can operate. And so those interests are changing, and they're changing their principles. I would argue that the changes are gradual and evolutionary. And so, for example, let's take the facility. The Chinese will say, yeah, we have an overseas facility, but it doesn't anywhere look like what you would call a U.S. military base. First of all, we have established this base, or this facility in Djibouti, next to a U.S. military base and next to a Japanese base. So the Chinese are very careful about how they're evolving the application of these principles. The Chinese will say no interference in the internal affairs of another country. Well, that is starting to evolve and change, because they recognize that great powers have interests in other countries, therefore we need to exert influence where we can. And so you're seeing an evolution of change and evolution of these principles. But I would argue that that evolution is taking place at a gradual level. You're not going to see, in my opinion, a sudden change in their foreign policy for a number of reasons. The most important being that for political reasons, this is the Chinese Communist Party's leadership legitimacy is based on some of what they've been feeding their citizens, and their legitimacy internationally has made these arguments. These are what Chinese principles are about. Therefore, you can rely on China to do the following things. And so their interactions in the UN, their interactions with us, their interactions with many of the countries are based on some of these principles. And so to suddenly change is going to have political repercussions for China. So I would argue that a couple of at least as far as principles are concerned, yes, there's an evolutionary change that we're going to see, more likely to be evolutionary. Now, even if you don't buy the argument that the principles can change like that, the things that can't be changed are the other factors that I've just talked about. Their position in the world vis-a-vis the United States, their role in the international system is evolving, changing. Yes, no question that cannot change overnight. Secondly, their economic development, that has to continue. Their focus on economic development, in my opinion, is not going to suddenly change. They're going to be hyper fixated on that. And so I just wanted to present this because this is a counter argument. These folks wrote a report specifically on China's international security activism. Their view by looking at different Chinese actions in the world. That's the Center for New American Security report that came out last year. And these are top-notch China analysts, so they're very good. In fact, one of them now is Joe Biden's Asia-Pacific security guy. So they're very good analysts. I just disagree on the rate of change. That they're saying China can turn on a dime. I'm saying that it's probably going to be more evolutionary change. So based on my conclusions, what's the implications for U.S. policy? And so, by and large, if you take your conclusions about what China is likely to do, it's largely going to be evolutionary. Their relations with Iran are not going to be particularly deep in terms of strategic depth. It's going to be more focused on economics. It's going to be more a gradual change. And in addition, the fact that China is going to want to maintain balance in the region, those are interests that are largely overlapping with the United States. So my general conclusion is U.S. policy doesn't alter much. That is, if we're after stability in the region, and we're looking for another country to actually help us maintain stability in the region. Actually, as James pointed out, maybe China serves a constructive role in helping maintain security. Now, that assumption is based only on the idea that the United States wants to maintain status quo in the Middle East. If our actual long-term policy is to take advantage of technological revolutions and access to the shale gas, and we actually want to depart from the region, then obviously that's a different conclusion. But by and large, if our policy is status quo, maintaining things as they are, then I don't see much of a change. The thing that we would probably need to do is engage with China, deal with the fact that China is increasing its economic and diplomatic influence in the region, and then we would then have to adjust, and actually we would need to compete economically, diplomatically in the region as China's influence starts increasing. Now, again, the one cautionary note is China could increase arms sales to Iran, so that is definitely something we should monitor. And I take the point of Jeffrey Payne, who started off this entire conversation with, yes, we need to watch China's interactions with Iran. Watching China interacting with Iran is probably good policy in general. So our intelligence community should probably focus on that and make sure we're watching as China interacts with Iran, because it is most likely that if China has a greater influence in the region, it is going to be through Iran. So with that, let me conclude, and I'm happy to take your questions.
So with regards to that relationship between Iran and China, do you see that, or what are your thoughts more on that has less to do with us as the United States and more to do with India? Because of that warm relationship that India and Iran have maintained, for several decades. Do you see that as the Chinese attempting to more focus on their India policy by U.S.
That's possible. I mean, yeah, the fact that the Chinese have to worry about India, which serves as a natural counterbalance to China, certainly would be a factor. So yeah, I would agree with that. But I would argue that China's interactions in the world, its foreign policy, always takes us into account, and so we always dominate we always dominate their calculus. So yes, India is a part of that calculation, but I would argue that the U.S. by far is the greater worry on China's part. The Chinese feel to some degree that they can handle India. That is, they can mess with India. It's a growing power, no question. But when you talk to the Chinese, they feel there's a degree of disdain to some degree, where they're like, yeah, we can handle the Indians. The U.S. is sort of a country that they're still trying to figure out, all right, how do we handle this hegemonic power that, yeah, literally we could destroy each other with nuclear weapons. So the U.S. is always dominant in their calculation. India certainly is a factor, but I would say the U.S. overshadows their concerns about India. Sir.
All right, you're talking about ARC, new ops, and how they might be doing that in the future. It's kind of more of a specific question, I guess. They have one aircraft carrier which they bought, and all it's good for is for training their aviators.
Yep.
So how far off is their amphibious shipping? Because I mean, how much of a real credible threat, for lack of a better way to describe it, would it be?
Yeah.
You know, because that's, I'm saying, like 10, 20 years down the road.
Well, they already have an LPD. They've got several LPDs. They've got, I think, 7 or 8 already. And those LPDs are going to the Gulf of Aden with, so they have that, and there are plans in the works perhaps for an LHD-like capability. And so, you know, I think they could perfectly do some sort of ARGMU type of operation within a decade or so. It's within their capability, and politically they would see no reason why they couldn't do it. And it's, to them, they get a lot of bang for the buck. And we get a lot of bang for the buck by doing ARGMU operations. So I don't see, in terms of equipment development, as that being a limitation at all. The question is, would they see an ARGMU operation as potentially concerning to the region and concerning to the United States? And I think that that's one they could socialize and eventually convince everyone, now these guys are going to be doing counterterrorism, NEO operations, HADR, all the kinds of things we like sending Marines to do. And it's not big enough to invade another country, but enough to have a political impact. And to me, that has China written all over it.
Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean,
Sorry about that.
Beijing calls.
Ni hao.
if you didn't want me to ask a question, I can see next time.
Yeah.
You make the point about the United States withdrawing its security guarantee, and I want to make the question actually a little more complicated. Because I don't think it's a question of the United States withdrawing that security guarantee. I think we have not just we stick with friends and partners, perhaps even longer than maybe we should.
Okay.
My question is this: what happens when the security guarantee no longer is viewed as credible by the people in the region? And so China now feels like it has to fill a vacuum that the United States doesn't feel that exists. So
Okay, so we got a lot of hypotheticals here. So well, the question is it lack of credibility, or do we actually not have the capability? We actually don't have the capability to do what we say we're going to do. I think if it's a lack of credibility question, it'll be a lot of, we're here, we're ready to support you, and the region saying, I don't think so. I don't think you really can do what you say you can do. Versus our actual inability to actually show up and do anything. I think in that case, I mean, the Chinese have friends too, so they'll be going around talking to a number of different actors in the region saying, okay, so you don't believe the United States actually can do these things. And the countries in the region would say, no, we don't believe they can do these things. I think the Chinese, being the cautious strategists that they are, what you would see next is these strategic dialogues between PLA NDU and US NDU would be a lot of discussion of that stuff. We're hearing from our pals in Saudi Arabia and in Oman that you guys really don't have the capability. You've just withdrawn this number of troops, you lack the capability. And so what's that about? So what you would see is a lot of China feeling out what's reality. And so I think that would be the next step. And if they conclude that the US actually lacks the capability to do anything, then there would be more of a discussion. Well, if you can't handle this, we need to go back to Beijing and talk about whether we need to do this. So I think that would be the next step. It wouldn't be they're going to go rushing in. I think there would be a conversation. Oddly enough, I think that it would be much more cooperative discussion than I think most people would think. At the same time, maybe we get defensive in our discussions with them. No, we're perfectly fine in doing that. I think at that point, the Chinese would say, all right, fine. Let's see how this plays out. And then as things become more disastrous for it. Now, I'm very uncomfortable with these hypotheticals, which aren't necessarily reality, but if this were the case and things are becoming disastrous for us, I think at that point the Chinese would then say, all right, we need to fill this vacuum, and we need to fill it now. So I hope that is more of a direct question that you're complicating my scenario. Yeah, Anthony.
Chris, the Saudis are much more sensitive to any overtures that China is making with Iran. So how is China assuaging the Saudis?
Oh, that's a great question. So the Chinese, the very skillful diplomats that they are, when they went and they formed a strategic partnership with Tehran, they immediately went to Saudi Arabia and said, and oh, by the way, we're extending sovereignty and recognition of the Yemeni government, which is the Saudi position. So the Chinese always show up bringing gifts. And so their gift to the Saudis was, okay, we're extending the strategic partnership with Tehran, but guess what we're bringing for you? And that sort of maintains the balance. But that to me perfectly illustrates China's play in this, which is they're going to go to one country and go, okay, this is what we're going to confer upon you, and then worried about the reaction from the rest of the region, particularly Saudi Arabia. They then go to Saudi Arabia and says, and here's the gift we're giving to you to maintain that balance. So yes, they're very sensitive to tilting one way or the other, but they're going to show up with efforts to sort of make things balanced out. Sure.
Saying that, in
Yeah.
the Middle East, frequently Middle East entities view someone who's neutral as an enemy. If you're not with me, you're against me. And that's one of the issues I'm not sure that China is properly looking at. Maybe they are. I mean, I'm not in Beijing. But that can be a problem for them. And they've already taken actions that have created new enemies in the East Asia area, Japan, the Philippines, together with their old enemies, Vietnam, India, and they're creating more discontent along their outer rings. So those cultures they know, cultures they don't have as much experience with in the Middle East, potentially present even greater dangers for them to get involved. And in the Middle East, I mean, you're talking multiple entities. We're talking U.S., China, but Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, who eventually they want a future go to war with, according to one article a few years ago. It's like 5th on their 6th must-have wars. I mean, they've got some dynamics in there that they may not be properly considered.
Yeah, that may be absolutely right. I mean, I guess you would take the argument one step further, whereas I'm saying that at best this makes China ineffectual as a political force in the region, and you're saying that it actually worsens the relations in the region, their relations in the region. That's possible.
I don't create a chaotic situation. There's a lot of balls bouncing around the billiard table at pretty high speed. They want to kind of slow roll through the
I mean, I'm not enough of a China and the Middle East expert to have a nuanced view of that. I mean, that's probably entirely possible. I'd want to talk to the two guys I just cited to get their sense of. So by the way, there's also a thesis that because China is neutral, it actually, the culture of the region may actually make them more enemies than they're expecting. What do you think of that? So I don't have enough of a feel for China's, over time, China's interactions with all the players to sort of give you a good feel for it. But that's an interesting point. So, okay. Yeah?
Kind of dovetail off what he's saying. Since, correct me if I'm wrong, but the PRC is still like officially an atheist society.
Yep.
And of course the Middle East is not.
Right.
How does that impact their relations with anyone over there?
Well, I mean, you sort of see the Middle Eastern countries saying, well, it's too bad the Chinese are atheists. They're not people of the book. But I do think the fact, and maybe this gets to your point, maybe the fact that they're so strictly neutral, I think maybe some of the countries of the Middle East have sort of said, okay, they really are neutral. They're worthless in terms of helping us solve any of our problems, but at least they're not taking sides on it, one side or the other. So I don't know. I'm not sure how religion specifically plays out. The fact that the Chinese they definitely are. They're avowed atheists and will proudly wear that on their sleeves. But I'm not sure how religion has affected the countries and their interactions with China. Again, because my expertise isn't sort of the day-to-day interaction between China and these countries. I don't think I can give you several good anecdotal evidence of that playing out. Sir.
You've emphasized for a lot of good reasons the Chinese-Iranian relationship, but it has had over the years pretty interesting bilateral relations with Israel, two-way arms trade right there.
Yeah.
And so you only mentioned Israel in terms of the Palestinians, but they don't give a damn about that. They care about stuff for them,
right,
and vice versa. And what about Egypt as well?
Right. So Egypt plays a role in that they need Egypt for their One Belt, One Road initiative, at least America. So the Suez Canal plays a key role there. So yes, they see Egypt as a key partner. And my talk really emphasized Saudi Arabia versus Iran, but yes, Egypt does play a role. And so there has been a lot of effort in terms of investment and infrastructure and smoothing of ties and improved relations between Egypt and China. So they're definitely putting a lot of balls in play with regard to its relationship with Egypt. With regard to Israel, yes, China has had a pretty good relationship with Israel. But I would argue that Israel often gets thrown under the bus when the larger economic interests come to play. That is, they'll say we're neutral. They'll say that we think the best approach to resolving the Palestine problem is, and they lay out their policy proposals, whatever. And they've been basically supportive of Israel in a number of different areas. Primarily because Israel has provided arms to China. They certainly like that. But I think my general observation is